Okay, we are now on chapter 10, covering blood. Blood transports everything that must be carried from one place to another in our bodies. Nutrients, waste, hormones, body heat is the only fluid tissue in the body. Sometimes lymphatic fluid is considered to be a fluid tissue, but generally speaking, blood is our fluid tissue. It's a type of connective tissue called connective tissue because it does in fact connect basically the entire body together via carrying this fluid around and all the nutrients and waste and everything else. Blood is made out of two primary parts: formed elements, which are the actual cells, the solid things, so to speak, that are within the blood, and then the plasma, which is a non-living fluid matrix that makes up most of the volume of the blood. When blood gets separated, erythrocytes will sink to the bottom. They make up a little less than half of the blood. This is called the hematocrit. There's a buffy or tan-colored layer that contains the leukocytes and platelets, which make up less than 1% of the blood. And then there's a plasma layer that sits on top. That's more than half the blood, and it's more of a clearish straw-colored fluid. So you can see here, if you've ever given blood or had blood taken, they take it out, then they put it into a small tube. They stick that tube into a centrifuge, which spins it at a high speed. And because blood is a suspension, not a true solution, it causes all of the particulates, all of the solid things, it causes everything to separate out by density. So that top layer, again, you have that straw-colored or yellowy clear fluid on top. That's your plasma. Plasma is about 90% water. It also acts as a solvent to carry other substances in the blood. There's lots of salts in there, plasma proteins, all kinds of stuff. And then the erythrocytes down there at the bottom are the red blood cells, the most numerous cells within your blood. And then you have all different types of white blood cells and platelets mixed together in that little thin tan layer that you see in the middle. Blood, as most of you are aware, is a sticky, opaque fluid. It is heavier and thicker than water. Oxygen-rich blood is a bright scarlet red color. Oxygen-poor blood is generally a deeper dull red color and can sometimes appear a little bit purple, but never blue. Despite what some of you may have heard, your blood is never blue. It just becomes a duller, darker red shade, sometimes looking a little purple, but never blue. It has a metallic, salty taste because it has metals and salts in it. Blood's pH is slightly alkaline. It's usually between 7.35 and 7.45. And blood temperature is usually slightly higher than body temperature. It's usually around 100 degrees Fahrenheit or slightly higher. We have about 5 or 6 liters of blood in our bodies. Remember now, a quart is slightly smaller than a liter, and 4 quarts makes a gallon. So about a gallon and a half of blood. Blood makes up about 8% of your body weight. The most abundant solutes found in blood plasma are the plasma proteins. Most of them are made by the liver. They include albumin, clotting proteins, and antibodies. So the albumin is important as a buffer to the pH of our blood and contributes to the osmotic pressure. Clotting proteins help stop blood loss. So they work with the platelets to cause clotting and stop bleeding. And then antibodies, of course, are a part of our immune system. Blood composition varies as cells exchange substances with the blood. The liver makes more proteins when certain levels drop. The respiratory and urinary systems restore blood pH to normal when blood becomes too acidic or too alkaline. So for example, buildup of CO2 in the body. We get rid of that because it can alter our pH. Plasma also helps distribute body heat because of the high heat capacity of water, which plasma is mostly comprised of. It's able to distribute body heat and maintain it. Red blood cells are called erythrocytes, erythro meaning red. White blood cells are called leukocytes, with leuko meaning white. And then thrombocytes, thrombo meaning clotting, is the technical term for platelets. And platelets are not actually complete cells, but just cell fragments. If you were to look at a smear of blood under the microscope, which we did during our tissues lab, this is about what it would look like. Of course, always depending a little bit on the stains used, the age of the slide, the preparation, things like that. Generally speaking, you're going to see erythrocytes everywhere. They're going to look either a tan or an orange or a pinkish color, depending on the stain, or a little bit reddish. Then you're going to see the white blood cells are going to be slightly larger for the most part. The biggest difference you'll see is that white blood cells have a nucleus inside them, and that nucleus will pick up more of the stain. So if you look at those neutrophils, you see that they have, in the lymphocyte, you see that they have dark spots inside them. That's where that nucleus picked up more stain. And then little tiny specks that typically pick up a lot of stain as well are the platelets. Erythrocytes, again, red blood cells, primarily function to carry oxygen. They differ from a lot of the other blood cells because they have no nucleus. They don't have very many organelles in them. Basically, they've jettisoned the majority of their internal parts in order to carry more hemoglobin so they can do their job better, which is primarily carrying oxygen throughout the body. Hemoglobin, of course, is that iron-bearing protein. It binds oxygen. Each hemoglobin molecule can bind 4 oxygen molecules, and each erythrocyte has about 250 million hemoglobin molecules. So each erythrocyte can then carry about 1 billion oxygen molecules. Normal blood contains 12 to 18 grams of hemoglobin per 100 milliliters of blood. There are several types of conditions, particularly anemias, that can cause homeostatic imbalance of our red blood cells. So anemia is a decrease in the oxygen carrying ability of blood, which can be due to either a lower than normal number of red blood cells or having an abnormal or deficient hemoglobin content within those red blood cells. Because remember, the hemoglobin is what the oxygen is actually binding to. So you might not have enough red blood cells in their entirety, or your red blood cells might not have enough or effective hemoglobin. Sickle cell anemia is a little different. That's a result of abnormally shaped hemoglobin. So a normal red blood cell has that biconcave shape. It's kind of like a donut, but without a hole in the middle, a dent instead. And then when it's sickle celled, because the hemoglobin is abnormally shaped, it kind of warps the shape of the cell itself into these unusual shapes that tend to bind together and jam up more. Polycythemia is another condition of red blood cells. Poly, of course, meaning many. That CYT in there, the site, that has to do with cells, and the hemia or emia means a condition of the blood. So a blood condition of many cells. In this case, specifically, we're talking about erythrocytes. It can be caused by bone marrow cancer because remember, cancer is uncontrolled cell growth. So if that uncontrolled cell growth happens in your bone marrow where red blood cells are produced, you can present with polycythemia. Living at higher altitudes can also increase your red blood cell count because when you live at a higher altitude, each breath you take contains fewer oxygen molecules. So to compensate, your body will create more red blood cells in order to be able to pull more oxygen out of each breath that you take. Increases in the red blood cell counts does, however, slow your blood flow and increase blood viscosity. So adding more cells to your blood necessarily makes it thicker. That means your heart has to work harder, your blood vessels can experience more stress, all sorts of things. So there are a lot of different types of anemia. Most of the time when you hear people talking about anemia, especially of course with women, it's iron deficiency anemia. So if you don't have enough iron in your diet, your hemoglobin doesn't have enough iron and it can't bind with as much oxygen. Of course, that is most common in women because of menstrual cycles. So they lose blood every month, which causes them to be deficient in iron. In that blood that's lost, you're losing iron. Women who are in the period of life where they're menstruating have to eat more iron or take iron supplements and have more iron in their diet to maintain adequate levels. Now, it can also be caused by sudden hemorrhage, which is bleeding. That's called hemorrhagic anemia. You've lost a lot of blood. Therefore, you have fewer red blood cells and less iron in your blood. Therefore, it's harder to carry oxygen. Hemolytic anemia happens when red blood cells get broken down because of bacterial infections. So some types of infections will actually attack red blood cells and break them down. Pernicious anemia is a lack of vitamin B12. Often there's a deeper level to that where you're missing something that allows your body to use B12 properly. Aplastic anemia is the depression or destruction of bone marrow by cancer, radiation, or certain medications. So if you either have a disease or treatments for a disease that are damaging your bone marrow, it's going to decrease the production of red blood cells. And again, we talked about sickle cell anemia. It's a genetic defect that leads to those abnormal, funny-shaped red blood cells, and they don't carry oxygen as well, and they also can kind of clot easily and clog things up. Happens mainly in people of African descent, but also is found in equatorial regions around the world to a lesser extent. And what we have learned is that there was actually a survival advantage to sickle cell anemia, because even though most people with sickle cell anemia tend to have a shorter life expectancy than the general population because it is a dangerous condition to have, it's been found that sickle cell trait is beneficial in providing resistance to malaria. So regions around the equator around the world where mosquitoes are heavy and there's lots of malaria, it could actually help people survive. So that's why the trait didn't die out, so to speak, or go away because of a survival disadvantage, because in those specific parts of the world, that mutation actually provided an advantage. So it made it more likely that you were able to survive if you got malaria. White blood cells are crucial in our body's defense system. They're primarily a part of our immune system. They are complete cells. They have a nucleus and they have organelles. They can move in and out of blood vessels. They have an ability to move around on their own. They respond to chemicals released by damaged tissues. This is called positive chemotaxis, where certain chemicals are released when your tissues get damaged that attracts them or causes them to act. They move by amoeboid motion, so that's the way an amoeba moves, of kind of moving around as a cell. Leukocytosis is a very common condition affecting white blood cells. It's where you have a white blood cell count above 11,000 cells per cubic millimeter. So if you've ever had your blood drawn because you were sick, what they do in those blood tests, one of the things they look at is your white blood cell count. So if your count is very high, they know that your body is fighting an infection. So that's probably the cause of your illness. Leukopenia is the opposite. So that's an abnormally low white blood cell count, usually caused by certain drugs. Corticosteroids can cause it, anti-cancer drugs can cause it, and a number of other things. Leukemia is actually where your bone marrow has cancer. And again, cancers are uncontrolled cell growth. So what it's doing is it's causing the white blood cells to be produced quickly and immaturely. So they're not fully developing. There are a lot of different types of leukocytes. So you have two main categories. There's granulocytes, which have little granules in their cytoplasm. So granulocytes means cells with little granules inside them. And they possess lobed nuclei. They include the neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. So all of those, if you look at them, they're images, illustrations, or under a microscope, you see what looks like little grains inside of the cell. Agranulocytes, that prefix A, meaning without or not having, lack visible granules. So if you looked at them, they would look very similar, but you wouldn't see those little specks or grains inside of them. Their nuclei also tend to be spherical, oval, or kidney-shaped as opposed to lobed, which we'll see the difference in a minute. This includes the lymphocytes and the monocytes. Now, one of the mnemonics that is often used to remember the relative abundance of white blood cells is never let monkeys eat bananas. You can come up with anything on your own, NLMEB. So neutrophils are the most abundant, then lymphocytes, then monocytes, then eosinophils, and then finally basophils are the least abundant white blood cells in our blood. Neutrophils, again, the most numerous. They are multi-lobed granulocytic cells. Their cytoplasm stains pink and contains fine granules. They function as phagocytes. Remember, phagocyte means devouring cell or eating cell, meaning that's how it destroys pathogens, as it consumes them. It takes them in and destroys them. They increase in numbers during infection. So they're one of the first ones you see their numbers shoot up when you have an infection. Eosinophils have a nucleus that stains blue-red. They have brick red cytoplasmic granules. They function to kill parasitic worms and also play a role in allergy attacks. Basophils are the rarest. They are large histamine-containing granules that stain dark blue. They contain heparin, which is an anticoagulant, meaning something that prevents clotting. And then in the agranulocytes, that's cells without visible granules in them, we have the lymphocytes, which are large, with a dark purple nucleus. They're slightly larger than red blood cells. They stay in our lymphatic tissue. That's where that lympho prefix comes from. They're white blood cells that stay in lymphatic tissues, and they play a role in our immune response as well. The monocytes are the largest of all the white blood cells. They have a very distinctive U-shaped nucleus. They function as macrophages when they migrate into the tissues and are important in fighting chronic infection. Platelets or thrombocytes are the fragments of megakaryocytes, which are multinucleate cells, so they break apart to become platelets, that are used for the clotting process. So their fragmented, splintery shapes aid them in being good at clotting. They snag onto damaged blood vessels and things like that better than, say, a round cell would. So a little summary with some images here. Those erythrocytes are that biconcave disc shape. They're red colored because they're carrying oxygen bound to iron. They can look kind of salmon colored a lot of the time, which means pinkish. And that's just because of they're thin and there's light passing through them. They're anucleate. They have no nucleus. They're basically just bags of hemoglobin that are designed to pick up oxygen. And then you see these different granulocytes. Notice the difference in the granules inside of them. So that's some of the easiest differences to tell. The cytoplasm stains slightly different colors in each of them, and then the granules stain very different colors in each of them and are slightly different relative sizes. But remember, all of these colors are not the colors that these cells are. So if you just took out some of your blood and looked at it, you would not see anything that looked like this. In order to be able to see things well under a microscope, we use stains in our slide preparation, and different parts of the cell pick up different colors of stain more. So if you're looking at microscope slides, these are the different ways that these things stain. And then finally, we have the agranulocytes and the platelets. You'll notice the lack of those little specks all over the place in the lymphocytes and monocytes. And the platelets, of course, are just these tiny little irregular fragments that are designed to be able to snag onto things essentially and start the clotting process. That's it for this first video. The next one I'll upload will cover hematopoiesis, hemostasis, and blood disorders.